For nearly half a century, she had ruled with a face the world was not allowed to see. Painters flattered her. Poets worshipped her. Courtiers bowed and compared her skin to moonlight and her eyes to divine fire. But the truth had been buried beneath powders and pearls. Beneath the mask of majesty, she forced herself to wear long after her youth had withered. Elizabeth, daughter of the man who destroyed a kingdom for love, had built her own legend upon iron, isolation, and illusion. And when she died, all of it cracked open. There are many portraits of Elizabeth I, stern, immaculate, eternal, but none of them prepare you for what came after her final breath, when the mask of power was replaced by another, colder mask, molded not from vanity, but from death itself. Her death mask, taken just days after she died, reveals not a queen, radiant and untouchable, but an old woman, hollowed by sorrow, eyes sunken, mouth slack with exhaustion, the features of someone who had held the world too tightly and been broken by the weight of it. To understand the horror of that mask, one must step into her final winter, the winter of the year 1603, when the palace that had once glittered with music and laughter grew quiet, and the Queen of England began to fade away from her own court. She had outlived nearly everyone she ever loved or trusted. Blanche Parry, the woman who had tended to her since childhood, died years earlier. William Cecil, her great counselor, whose mind had balanced her temper for decades, was gone. Catherine Howard, her lady of the bedchamber and the keeper of so many of her secrets, followed them to the grave. The court she once commanded with a flick of her hand had grown gray and thin, its laughter replaced by whispers about the Queen's failing health. She began to eat less. She refused to sleep. She withdrew from her council, the flame that had burned for 45 years, the same flame that had defied kings and popes, that had stared down the Armada and executed Mary of Scotland, began to tremble. She left the noise of Whitehall behind and retreated to Richmond Palace, the place she had once called her sanctuary. But Richmond was no longer filled with music. Its long halls echoed only with the steps of anxious servants and the creak of the wind against the shutters. Those who saw her there did not see the Virgin Queen they had known. They saw a figure draped in black, standing for hours at her window, gazing at nothing, as if she could already see the shadow of her own death walking across the gardens. Her ladies begged her to eat, but she refused. They begged her to rest, but she would not lie down. She told them she could not, because if she did, she would never rise again. She stood until her legs shook, until her breath came shallow, until her mind began to drift somewhere between this world and another. It was as if she was waiting for something or someone. In those sleepless nights, the ghosts came. The court never spoke of it publicly, but the servants whispered it for generations after that. The Queen had begun to see her cousin Mary, the woman she had executed 16 years earlier, that she wept alone and said over and over, "I never consented," that she saw shadows moving in corners and heard a voice in the silence asking whether she was ready. She who had once been so fearless, who had spoken to armies and thundered to her council that she had the heart of a king, now trembled at the things she could not command: her guilt, her ghosts, her God. She was haunted not by enemies, but by memory. By the beginning of that year, Elizabeth had lost all appetite for life. She no longer wanted food, or drink, or conversation. She shrank into herself like a candle guttering before its final flicker. Her ladies, terrified, summoned physicians, but she refused to let them near her. No man could help her now, she said. Her illness was not of the body. Perhaps she knew the truth, that she had been poisoning herself for years with the lead and mercury she used to paint her skin, covering the pockmarks that smallpox had left behind. Perhaps she knew her body was already surrendering. Or perhaps she simply no longer cared. What she could not hide anymore was the slow unraveling of her mind. She had always controlled every image, every painting, every rumor. Now, in these last weeks, she could not even control her own reflection. In March, when even her closest attendants began to whisper that she would not live much longer, she finally allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury to enter her chamber. He told her that God had prepared a place for her in heaven, that she would be a queen there, as she had been on earth. And she said nothing in reply. She only stared ahead, her lips pressed together, as if the promise of heaven was a comfort too late. On the 24th day of March, in the year 1063, Elizabeth Tudor, last of the Tudors, Queen of England, Ireland, and the seas beyond, exhaled her last breath in the palace she had loved. Surrounded not by family but by silence, they kept her body for 3 weeks at Whitehall, guarded and veiled, before it was moved for burial. And sometime in that still, a secret space between death and entombment, someone came with plaster and linen to take her likeness to capture what the mirror of life had hidden. The mask they made was cold, unflinching, mercilessly real. It did not show the fiery queen of the Armada portraits or the painted goddess with ageless eyes. It showed the truth, an old woman, frail and worn, whose reign had drained the color from her face and the joy from her eyes. The mask's features are calm, yes, but not peaceful. They are tired, human, haunted. That mask became the model for her funeral effigy, and later for her tomb in Westminster Abbey, where she now lies above her half-sister Mary, the woman she conquered in life and outshone in memory. On the marble effigy, she is again dressed in jewels and crowned in gold. But the face beneath the carving, the shape of the mouth, the curve of the brow comes from that final mold taken in the cold after her death. And if you look closely at it, even now, even through centuries of reverence and restoration, you can still see the truth that the painters dared not show, that beneath the crown, Elizabeth had been merely a woman, exhausted by her own myth. It is strange how the face that once ruled nations has become so haunting in stillness. The same lips that ordered the execution of Mary Stuart, the same eyes that watched the Spanish Armada burn, now stare blankly forward through time, as if asking a question that no one can answer. Was it worth it? The power, the fear, the solitude. The mask does not reply. It simply looks back, eternal and silent. Its beauty stripped away, its glory turned to dust. And maybe that is why the world cannot look away, because in that face, frozen between majesty and mortality, we see not a queen at all, but the cost of being one. It was not a palace anymore, not in the final days. Richmond, once a royal retreat carved in green along the river, once a refuge of poets and courtiers and silver laughter trailing down the stairs at dusk, had become something smaller, heavier, and quieter. The queen had gone there not to reign, but to retreat, not to hold court, but to hide. And the rooms she chose were not grand halls lit with chandeliers and filled with tapestries embroidered in French gold, but narrow spaces lined with old wood, where light came soft and slow, filtered through shutters that stayed half-closed. As if the day itself did not wish to intrude, the door to her chamber remained shut, And though servants still passed in and out, and though physicians paced in the corridors with wrung hands and unspoken thoughts, something in that room had already closed itself off from the world, long before Elizabeth's breath gave out. She was not waiting to die. She was already, in 1,000 invisible ways, gone. It was in this room that the Queen, once Elizabeth Regina, Virgin of England, sword of Protestantism, heir of Henry. It stood motionless for hours at a time, refusing rest, refusing warmth, refusing even the touch of hands that had served her for decades. Her ladies, the few who remained, whispered among themselves, not with gossip, but with dread. They had known her in so many forms, playful and imperious, witty and wrathful, radiant and terrifying, but they had never seen her like this, statuesque, rigid, drained of color, barely speaking, barely blinking, as if she were already a carving on her own tomb. They begged her to lie down, to eat, to speak, but she would only shake her head or raise a trembling hand to silence them. Sometimes, when pressed, she whispered that if she lay down, she would not rise again, and they believed her not because she spoke it as prophecy, but because it sounded too much like fact. She would not eat. She would not drink. The physicians were not allowed to approach her bed. And when one was finally summoned in desperation, she dismissed him with a glance, so cold it turned the marrow of his bones. It was not that she did not know she was dying, she did. It was that she had chosen to do it her way. She who had lived as a symbol would now vanish without spectacle. No public vigils. No deathbed declarations. No theatrics. Just the long, slow shrinking of presence. Until only the walls remembered. The women who waited outside her door were not just courtiers. They were ghosts of her past. Blanche Parry was already gone. Catherine Howard, once her closest confidant, had just died weeks before. And the Queen, when told of Catherine's death, did not cry. She simply stared forward, her hands clutching the arms of her chair, and sat for hours without moving, as if the news had not shocked her, but confirmed what she had already known, that there was no one left. Everyone she had ever leaned on, everyone who had ever spoken her name without fear, was gone. What remained were duty and dread, silence and fading breath. She stood still so long that her legs swelled and her attendants had to carry her, but when they tried to ease her into bed, she refused. Shaking them off with surprising strength, she would stand, she said, even if her body would not last. She would meet death on her feet. And so she stood, draped in layers of black, her skin pale beneath the powder that no longer covered what she no longer cared to hide, and her eyes fixed on nothing. At times, she spoke softly to herself. At times, she muttered words that none could understand. At times, she listened, truly listened, as if someone were speaking to her from beyond the edge of the chamber. They said she had begun to see Mary. They said the spirit of the Scottish Queen, her cousin, her mirror, her victim, stood at the foot of her bed when night fell. That Elizabeth whispered, apologies no one would ever record. That she woke with tears on her face and spoke of sins she swore she had not committed. That she claimed she had not given consent. Not for the axe, not for the silence, not for the lonely ending. But it did not matter. The ghosts do not listen for excuses. And Mary, in whatever form she came, did not speak. She only stood, watching, outside. The courtiers murmured of succession. James of Scotland was already waiting. The heir of the palace, once thick with incense and command, now hummed with uncertainty. What happens when a queen who has ruled alone for nearly 5 decades no longer draws breath? What happens when the sun, which had refused to set for so long, begins to dim by its own will? No heralds announced her decline. No proclamations were made. But they all knew. The queen was slipping, and there would be no pulling her back. And yet, she was not entirely alone. Her final companions were not ministers or monarchs, but women, quiet, loyal, fading women, who had brushed her hair, laced her gowns, brought her wine, heard her secrets, and stood beside her in silence as time pulled its thread through their lives. It was they who stayed when others fled. It was they who wept in private when she would not allow tears in public. And it was they who, even in those final moments, called her majesty and waited for her command, even though none would come. As March crept forward, Elizabeth began to sleep more, speak less. She no longer stood. She no longer resisted. She did not ask for food. Her eyes, once sharp enough to pierce an ambassador's lie at a glance, now drifted unfocused across the ceiling, or closed for hours. Her hands, once restless with decision and power, lay still on her lap, twisted with age, knuckles swollen with time. She had never married. She had never named an heir. And now, she would never speak again. In her final day, she was at last laid in bed. A bishop was brought. The Archbishop of Canterbury sat beside her and prayed aloud, blessing her soul, telling her she would be a queen in heaven. She gave no reply, but her eyes met his, and in them, for a brief moment, he said he saw something that looked like peace or surrender. No court painter captured that gaze. No record preserves the words she never spoke. But the bishop remembered, and so it passed into memory like a whisper, that in her final breath, she was no longer a monarch, no longer a legend, no longer even Elizabeth I, but simply a woman letting go. On the 24th of March, in the year 1063, as the river moved gently beyond the palace walls and the sky held the pale stillness of early spring, the last Tudor died. Not with a shout, not with a curse, not with a crown, but in silence, surrounded by fading names and half-heard prayers, in a room that sealed itself the moment she left it. And once she was gone, no footsteps returned. They had been there from the beginning, not always the same faces, not always the same hands, but always women, always watchers, always silent attendants moving like breath behind velvet curtains and along cold stone walls, stitching together the myth of a queen who refused to show the world anything but command. Elizabeth had surrounded herself with women from her first days at court, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. Men could betray her with words, with alliances, with ambition. But women, especially the ones she allowed close, served her not only with loyalty, but with their entire lives. They dressed her. They watched her sleep. They read the tension in her shoulders before she spoke a word. And when her reign entered its final winter, it was not men with scrolls and titles who stood closest to her bed. It was the women who had known her breath when it faltered, her moods when they cracked, her silences when they screamed louder than any speech. Some of them had grown old with her. Blanche Parry had died long before Elizabeth herself began to unravel. But her absence lingered like a perfume that never quite faded from the corridors. Catherine Howard, no. Not the queen who lost her head, but the Countess of Nottingham, who had served Elizabeth faithfully for over 4 decades, had passed only weeks before Elizabeth herself began to fade. And those who were near the Queen said something shifted in her when that news arrived. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply sat very still. Her hands clutched tight in her lap, and stared at the far wall of her chamber as if she could see something beyond it. Something waiting. Catherine had been more than a lady of the bedchamber. She had been a mirror that did not lie. A presence that tethered Elizabeth to the days when youth had still lived in her veins. Without her, something unspoken dissolved. It was not just grief, it was a kind of detachment. A slow slipping of identity. As if the Queen had finally accepted that the world she built had already begun to disappear. The other women, those still alive, tried, in quiet desperation, to anchor her. They brought her news from court. Though she no longer listened. They brought trays of food she would not touch. They brought warm cloths, softened boots, fresh linen, small signs of life and care. But none of it stirred her. At night, they watched as she stood motionless for hours. Too proud to collapse, but too weak to keep rising. They begged her to sleep. But Elizabeth had begun to fear what sleep would bring, for it was in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the corridors were silent and the candles guttered low, that the guilt came. Mary. The name was never spoken aloud in the Queen's final days. Not by the bishops. Not by the physicians. Not even by the most trusted ladies who had heard it, whispered again and again from the Queen's own lips. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Her cousin. Her prisoner. Her shadow had died, by Elizabeth's orders, nearly 2 decades earlier. And yet the memory had grown louder. Not quiete. As the Queen approached her own end, Elizabeth had always insisted that the execution had not been her wish. She had stalled. She had hesitated. She had raged when the warrant was carried out. But everyone had known, even then, that nothing happened without her approval. And now, as the light in her eyes dimmed and the threads of her legend began to loosen, it was Mary's face, not her father's, not her lover's, not even her subjects that Elizabeth seemed to see in the dark. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn, she would reach out into empty air, murmuring things no one could decipher. Sometimes she would sob silently, the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deeper than grief, a sobbing rooted in something closer to fear. Her ladies did not ask questions. They only brought her warm towels and pressed her fingers gently, whispering prayers to a God they hoped would not judge her as harshly as she judged herself. One woman claimed to have found the Queen weeping in her chair, whispering, "I never said yes. I never said yes." Another said she heard the Queen talking to someone invisible, begging them not to come closer. No one dared write these moments down. But the stories passed on, breath to breath, until they settled into memory, like dew on the grass, quiet, chilling, indéniable. And it was not just Mary. There were others. Elizabeth had signed death warrants for nobles, for enemies, for men and women she believed to be threats to her crown. She had ruled with a heavy hand, not because she was cruel, but because she believed she had to be, alone on the throne, with no husband, no heir, no army of brothers or uncles to stand behind her. She had forged herself into something unbreakable, but steel bends with time. And now, in the slow disintegration of her mind and body, the shadows of those decisions returned, not as ghosts in chains, but as thoughts that gnawed at her heart with relentless persistence. Did they hate me? Did they forgive me? Was it necessary? These were questions she had never asked while the world still watched her. But now, with only her women nearby, and her crown already slipping from reach. She asked them with every silent glance toward the fire. Her ladies watched all of this. They watched her fade. Not in violence or spectacle, but in a kind of unraveling. Day by day, the queen became lighter, quieter, less visible. The woman who had once burned with ferocity now hovered like a shadow in her own chamber. She still had strength, but it was brittle. She still gave orders, but only with her eyes. When she finally agreed to lie in her bed, it was not defeat. It was a silent acknowledgement that she could stand no longer. The women tucked her in gently, as they had done 1,000 times before. But this time, her body did not curl for warmth. It lay still, flat, and cold, as if she had simply decided that there was nothing left worth holding on to. They remained by her side in those final nights, reading psalms aloud, brushing her thinning hair, holding her hands. They told her she was loved, even if she didn't respond. They promised her that the people remembered, that the country was safe, that her name would endure, and perhaps she heard them. Perhaps those final words were the balm that eased the ache of her guilt. Perhaps not, but it was those women, the watchers, the faithful, the silent, that carried her through her last hours. Not bishops, not nobles, not foreign kings, just women, just hands that had tied her laces, voices that had sung her to sleep, faces that had never left, even as everyone else did. They had seen her powerful. They had seen her cruel. And now, they saw her human. And when the queen finally slept, truly slept, they did not weep. Not yet. They only sat in the silence, listening for one more breath that did not come. They say death comes in a breath. But for Elizabeth, it came like the final note of a song no one knew had ended. The room was quiet that night, more than usual, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. The fire in the hearth had grown low, casting long shadows on the folds of her coverlet, and the candlelight flickered just enough to blur the line between body and shadow. Her ladies sat nearby, not daring to speak. One of them held her hand, fingers delicate and thin, as pressed flowers. Another sat with her eyes closed, whispering a prayer not for glory, but for rest. The queen had not spoken in hours. Her chest moved shallowly, rhythm fading, like a tide pulling back across a dark shore. No announcement was made. No final phrase was offered. No grand last word. The breath simply stopped, and for a few seconds, no one breathed with her, as if the silence demanded tribute. It was the 24th of March. In the year 1063, the stars above Richmond Palace glowed soft and disinterested, and the River Thames murmured past the stone walls without concern. Inside, Elizabeth Tudor, the last Tudor, the last child of Henry and Anne, the woman who had ruled alone longer than any English sovereign before her, had slipped out of the world without a sound. The archbishop who had sat at her side, praying softly into the folds of her bedclothes, lowered his head. He had told her only hours earlier that she would reign in heaven as she had on earth. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he only said it to soothe a woman who had begun to fear not death itself, but what death would reveal. There was no crying, not yet. The women who had watched her die had given their tears to her already. In secret, in corners, in candlelit whispers. Now, they moved with calm hands, practiced and slow. They crossed her arms. They straightened her hair. They closed her eyes. The body of the queen, now no longer queen, was still, And outside that room, the world waited. Not with cheering, not with mourning, but with uncertainty, because there was no heir waiting in the next room. There was no son to ascend the throne before the Queen grew cold. There was only a name, James of Scotland, and a hope that word would reach him before chaos did. The body was not immediately moved. It remained at Richmond for a short time, then was taken to Whitehall Palace, not in a royal procession, but in solemn, unannounced quiet. There it was placed in a dark chamber, hung with black cloth, surrounded by flickering torches and guards, who spoke only when they had to. She lay there for 21 days. Her body watched not only by courtiers, but by uncertainty itself. For though it had long been assumed that James, the son of Mary Stuart, would succeed her, no formal declaration had ever been made in life. And now, in death, the throne waited. Those 3 weeks were not filled with ceremony, but with hesitation. Messengers galloped north. Councils whispered. Nobles wavered. What Elizabeth had built in 45 years had no instruction for what to do when her breath failed. She had controlled her own legend so tightly that even her departure felt like a secret. And in that silence, the kingdom held its breath with her. Inside the room at Whitehall, her ladies remained. Some came and went, but others stayed through the night. Through the still hours, when the corridors outside grew colder and even the guards looked away, they rearranged the folds of her shroud. They kept the torches lit. They prayed aloud. And when they could not bear to speak, they prayed in silence. Not because she was holy, not because she had become something larger than herself, but because they had loved her in the quiet, difficult, complicated way that only those who serve closely ever can. They had seen her fury and her fear. They had been the keepers of her secrets and the witnesses of her solitude. And now, they were her only audience. It was during this vigil that her death mask was made. A physician, perhaps two, entered quietly. A warm cloth was placed on her face, softening the skin. Then plaster was poured, carefully, gently, into a mold pressed against her features. It dried slowly. They peeled it away, revealing the negative space of a legend. The mask that remained captured not the iconography, not the glory, not the virgin radiance carved into portraits, but the truth, the softness of age, the hollowness of long rule, the stillness of a woman no longer holding herself upright. It did not smile. It did not scowl. It simply was blank and quiet, like the face of someone who had finally stopped fighting. That mask would later become the model for her effigy. It would be polished, refined, dressed in jewels and crowned in gold. But underneath it all, it would still hold the memory of those final hours when power gave way to peace, and silence became the only crown she needed. Outside, England shifted. James received word. He accepted the crown. And though he rode to London with banners and titles, though Parliament declared him king with great fanfare, the heart of the realm still beat slowly in the darkened rooms where Elizabeth's body lay. The crown had moved, but something else had ended. When her coffin was finally lifted, it was heavy, not with jewels, not with gold, but with the weight of 45 years of choices, alliances, executions, silences. It passed through streets, hung with black, beneath windows crowded with faces, unsure whether to mourn or marvel. It was carried to Westminster, where a new tomb waited. It would rest above that of her half-sister, Mary, the very woman Elizabeth had feared and conquered, whose memory had haunted her to her final breath. Some said she had demanded to be buried above Mary to prove, even in death, who had prevailed. Others whispered that she had only wanted to be remembered, not as a woman, not even as a queen, but as someone who had ruled alone and survived it. But for 3 long weeks, before that final burial, before the marble and the Latin and the history books, she had lain in silence, not triumphant, not tragic, just still. And in that stillness, the crown waited not for a head to rest upon, but for the weight to shift, the reign to pass, on the story to turn its next page. Long before her skein cooled, Elizabeth had learned how to hide behind images. For decades, her likeness had been painted not with brush and pigment alone, but with caution and calculation. She knew better than any monarch alive that power did not reside only in the sword or the crown or the words uttered from a throne, but in the face the world believed was real. That was why her portraits never aged. That was why her eyes were always wide, her hair always rich, her posture always unyielding. Artists were instructed no lines beneath the chin, no sag in the neck, no weariness in the brow. She was to be eternal, a symbol unbent by time. And when time began to show itself in the mirror, she did not weep. She powdered it white, lined it with rouge, and painted over every hint that she was, in truth, mortal. But the mask of death does not flatter. When the plaster was poured over her face in that quiet chamber at Whitehall, it captured no illusions. It did not honor propaganda. It did not listen to courtly tradition or fear royal wrath. It settled into every wrinkle, into every hollowness beneath the eyes, into the slight slack of a mouth no longer guarded. And when it was lifted away, it revealed the one image of Elizabeth that no artist had dared to paint, and that perhaps only death itself had the courage to render. It showed the truth not of failure, not of shame, but of exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying an entire kingdom alone for nearly half a century. The exhaustion of being queen, woman, myth, and human, all at once. With no husband, no child, and no permission to falter. That mask, preserved and passed down, would come to hold a power her living portraits never did. Because while those paintings hung in galleries, eyes de fion, gowns elaborate, framed in gold, the death mask sat quiet and unadorned, and yet spoke louder than the painted lies. It did not shout. It did not demand. It only looked back, steady and solemn, a mirror to the life she had spent so long hiding. And in that stillness, there was something almost kind, not flattering but honest. And perhaps, in the end, honesty is the one luxury even a queen cannot afford until she is beyond needing it. That mask was used to sculpt her effigy, the statue that would lie atop her tomb. Sculptors traced the contours of her brow, shaped the curve of her lips, molded the weight of her face from that final impression, and then they dressed it in magnificence. The effigy wore a ruff of intricate lace. Jewels glittered across her chest. A crown sat atop her stiff coiffed hair, and a scepter rested by her hand. She lay in stone, not as she had died, but as she had once ruled, majestic, eternal, undisturbed. But even beneath the marble, even beneath the symbols, some truth from that mask remained. The shape of her face was not young. The eyes were not sharp. The mouth did not smile. It was not the portrait she had spent her life crafting. It was, instead, the face the earth had received. They laid her to rest in Westminster Abbey, But the word rest is only partly true, for Elizabeth did not lie alone. She was placed above her half-sister, Mary Tudor, the queen she had defeated, the queen who had burned Protestants and ruled in fire, the queen whose body lay beneath her, now in stone silence. Some said it was Elizabeth's final assertion of dominance, that even in death, she would not kneel. Others believed it was symbolic, a reconciliation across time and bloodlines. But whatever the intention, the tomb spoke as loudly as any monument could. One lay below. One lay above. One had been replaced. One had endured. And carved into the stone were words not of rivalry, but of peace. Consorts in realm and tomb. Here we sleep. Elizabeth and Mary. Sisters in hope of resurrection. It was a generous phrase. Hopeful. Almost tender. As though all that had passed between them, faith and fire, blood and exile, imprisonment and execution, could be softened by the cold touch of eternity. Perhaps it was true, or perhaps it was written not for the dead, but for the living, who needed to believe that even queens could forgive. Yet beneath those words, the mask still whispers. It whispers of a woman who controlled her image with iron, who refused to let the world see her age, who wore wigs over hair that had thinned to wisps and painted over a face pocked by illness, who covered weakness with silks and solitude with grandeur, who wielded her femininity as both weapon and shield, and who, at the end, when none of it could protect her, lay still in a bed where only her women wept. The tomb stands grand, immense, regal, one of the most commanding in all the abbey. Tourists pass by it every day. Some read the inscription. Some pause in wonder. Some move on without a thought. But none of them see the face beneath. Not the marble face. Not the portrait. Not the legend. The real face. The mask, the one made in silence, the one that did not lie. And so, in that quiet vault beneath vaulted stone and centuries of worship, Elizabeth sleeps, not beneath crowns and battles, but beneath something more fragile memory, not of victory, but of vulnerability, not of glory, but of grace. And though the effigy lies with scepter in hand and power carved into her spine, history knows the mask told the truth. And that truth, once spoken, never sleeps again. There was a time, long before the last winter, when Elizabeth's face was not yet a battlefield. In the early years of her reign, her skin had glowed with youth. Her eyes were fierce and bright. Her hair still the deep auburn of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and though the years would weather her as they weather every sovereign, she refused, absolutely, refused to allow the world to see her fade. Age was not only an enemy, it was a threat to power. In a court ruled by image and illusion, a wrinkle could become a rumor, a tired gaze, a sign of weakness. So she chose not to age. Or rather, she chose to create a face that would not be allowed to do so. The face she built was white, so white it glowed beneath candlelight like porcelain. But it was not her natural skin. It was paint. And beneath that paint was poison. The secret was no secret at all, though no one dared speak it aloud. She wore a foundation made of white lead and vinegar, known in her time as ceruse, a mixture both elegant and deadly. She layered it thickly, not just to preserve her image, but to conceal the scars of the smallpox that had ravaged her skin in her 20s. The pockmarks it left behind were not deep, but they were enough to remind her of vulnerability. And Elizabeth had no tolerance for being seen as vulnerable, so she covered it, day after day. Year after year, She painted over herself until her skin could no longer breathe. The lead soaked into her pores, leached into her blood, and found its way into the hollows behind her eyes, and the marrow of her bones, and the courtiers whispered, gently, carefully, that the queen looked pale, that her hands trembled when she reached for the goblet, that her moods darkened with more frequency, that her memory was not as sharp as it once had been. They said it gently, always gently, because to speak of the queen's decay was to tempt the very wrath she had shown so many others. But her ladies knew. They had touched her face when the paint was wiped away at night. They had seen the fragile skin beneath, thin and graying, the fine cracks that no layer of ceruse could smooth. They had watched her grow weaker, not just with age, but with something deeper, something that lived beneath the skin. They knew the headaches came more often, the moods more erratic, the fatigue heavier. They never said the word poison, but they saw it every day. Still, she would not stop. Vanity was too easy a word for it. It was not about beauty alone. It was about control. As long as she could command her face, she could command the court. As long as she looked ageless, she was ageless. As long as her image endured, so did her power. To strip away the paint would be to let the world in, to admit that she was like every woman before her, and after flesh and blood and time. And so she kept painting, even when the mirror no longer smiled back. Toward the end, even her attendants tried to intervene. They brought gentler mixtures. They suggested oils and balms, but she refused them. The old formula remained. The lead remained. And the pain remained. She had built an empire atop the appearance of invincibility. She would not let it crumble beneath the truth. And so, it was no wonder, in the final months, that her body began to fail in ways that even death could not hide. Her teeth blackened, her hair thinned to wisps, her skin, beneath the paint, sagged and yellowed. And still, she rose each day and asked for the powders and paints. She would rather die painted than live undone. By the time she withdrew to Richmond Palace, the damage was done. Her immune system was failing. Her appetite was gone. Her body, long tormented by trace metals and endless stress, had begun to shut down in quiet rebellion. Some have speculated that it was cancer. Others have suggested pneumonia. But many, even at the time, believed it was the paint itself, the beautiful, deadly paint that had eaten her alive from within. When she died, no physician dared write it. No record accused her vanity. No paper bore the words, "lead poisoning." It would not have been permitted. It would have been blasphemy. But the mask she left behind told part of the story: the hollowness of the cheeks, the tightness around the jaw, the deep-set eyes. There was not only age, it was damage. It was the price of illusion. Even after hair embalming, those who prepared her body remarked that the paint still clung to her face. They had to wash her, gently, layer by layer, wiping away not just powder, but decades of deception. And when at last the skin was bare, they saw the woman who had been buried beneath it, older, frailer, but no less regal. A queen, still, but one no longer hidden. And so, as they cast the death mask, they chose not to cover it again. The mask showed her unpainted, unguarded, unretouched. And in doing so, it became the most honest likeness of Elizabeth ever made. Not a lie told in flattery, but a truth told in stillness. That mask, cold and pale, now whispers to those who study it, It whispers of lead, and fear, and pride, and pain. It whispers of a queen who ruled her country with courage, but ruled her own image with desperation. It whispers that no power, no crown, no throne, no act of will, no matter how strong, can stop the creeping hand of time or the quiet revenge of poison. And still, it stares. Quiet, eternal, honest. It had once rested so easily above her brow. That golden ring of sovereignty, weightless in appearance, yet heavy in meaning. A symbol not only of rule, but of resistance. A badge forged in defiance of expectation. Elizabeth had worn it, not like an ornament, but like a declaration. She was not wife, not mother, not consort. She was sovereign. She had never shared her throne, had never knelt beside another, had never crowned a child of her own. For 45 years, the crown had belonged to her alone. And now, as her body lay silent in its final chamber, that same crown stood in a strange and lonely stillness, not upon her head, not in another's hands, but waiting at her feet, as if uncertain who would be bold enough to lift it next. They had placed it there, not just as a gesture of reverence, but as acknowledgement. The realm had no queen now, not in body, not in breath, and yet her presence still lingered like incense, threading through the stonework of Whitehall, seeping into the hearts of those who had known only her voice as the voice of England. The courtiers passed by in silence, their eyes lowered, unsure whether to look at the crown or the woman it had once adorned. For all its shimmer, it now seemed smaller, duller, somehow. Not because it had changed, but because she was no longer beneath it. The question of succession had long haunted the edges of her reign. Like a draft in a locked room, she had refused, year after year, to name an heir, whether it was caution or calculation. No one ever truly knew. She would say little when asked, sometimes nothing at all. She had seen too many claimants, stirred too much ambition. She had witnessed how whispers of tomorrow could unravel the loyalty of today, so she left the crown untethered, floating above her head like a sword held by willpower alone, and dared anyone to ask what would happen when she could no longer keep it there. And now, at last, it had fallen, not violently, not with blood, but with a hush so deep it seemed to muffle the corridors of state. James of Scotland would be king. That much had become clear. The messengers had ridden. The seal had passed. But still, the finality of it had not settled into the hearts of the people. Not yet. For how could it? Elizabeth had not merely ruled a country, she had embodied it. Her very image had fused with the soul of her nation. And now, that image had been placed in a coffin, while the gold circlet that once crowned it sat untouched, watched over by men who dared not lift it too soon. There is a silence that follows greatness. Not applause, not grief, but the kind of silence that feels like waiting, a held breath, a pause in a great story. That was the silence that lingered in the days after Elizabeth's death. No sermons yet dared proclaim her legacy. No monument yet sang of her triumphs. The body was still warm in memory. The crown was still cold on the cushion. The people, from noble to peasant, whispered her name, not with reverence or resistance, but with uncertainty. What now? The procession that carried her from Whitehall to Westminster passed beneath skies that offered no sign. The river moved beside it, calm and gray, neither mourning nor celebrating. The bells tolled. Yes, but even their echo seemed uncertain. The nobles who followed her coffin did so in order, but not in unity. For though they honored the queen, their minds had already begun to turn to the new monarch, to their places in the coming reign, to the shifts that follow every death. And still, she lay. The effigy above her was carved with the crown once more placed upon her brow. And yet beneath that marble face, her body remained stripped of all earthly titles. There were no decrees from the grave, no posthumous commands, only silence. The kind that stretches between worlds, the kind that lingers in the folds of velvet drapery and the seams of funeral gloves, the kind that asks not loudly, but with aching softness, was it enough Elizabeth had outlived her siblings, outlasted the men who had doubted her, outgoverned the kings who had threatened her. She had transformed a fragile nation into a power feared by empires. She had built an image so radiant that even time had dared not challenge it until her body forced its hand. And now, with all that behind her, the crown she had worn with such force rested at her feet, not buried with her, not passed directly to another, but caught in the space between memory and future, between reverence and forgetting. And in that space, her name echoed Elizabeth Regina, but it echoed softly now, not shouted from the battlements, not proclaimed in Parliament, not etched in fresh law. It hung instead like a perfume in the halls, a scent of something that had once filled the air, and now could only be traced by those who remembered. The silence did not last forever. Of course, crowns do not wait long. The throne must be warmed again. The reign of a Stuart would rise, and Elizabeth's name would begin the slow transformation from presence to legend. But for that moment, for those few strange days when her soul had not yet settled and her body had not yet been lowered, there was only this, a crown resting quietly at the feet of a woman who had spent her life refusing to kneel. It was not by accident that Elizabeth died alone. That truth, though softened by centuries and gilded in legend, remains one of the most solemn facts of her reign. She had been surrounded by ladies. Yes, by counselors and bishops and courtiers who bowed as she passed, who brought her news and silks and reports and incense. But she had died with no child at her side, no husband to whisper her name, no warm legacy in blood to reach out and take her hand. The chamber in which she slipped away had grown smaller not only with age, but with the absence of anyone who could call her mother or wife. The silence that followed her final breath was not only royal, it was deeply, inescapably human. For all her greatness, she left behind no one who had sprung from her, no one who bore her blood forward into the next century. The line of Tudor kings and queens ended not with war or murder, but with the fading heartbeat of a queen who had chosen herself over succession. And yet, it had always been that way. From the first years of her reign, Elizabeth had made it clear she would not marry unless she chose to. And she would not be ruled. In a world where queens were expected to become mothers first and monarchs second, she had reversed the roles and made herself the center of power, not its conduit. Suitors came and went. The King of Spain, the Duke of Anjou, Englishmen who dared to hope, but she remained unwed, untouched by alliance. Hier Ringfingerbar, I am married to England, she once declared. And the words, though romantic in their echo, were forged in policy as much as passion. To marry would mean to submit, to compromise, to risk. And Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn's downfall and Henry's fury, had learned too well what marriage could cost a woman with a crown. And so, she ruled alone. But solitude, once chosen, becomes a weight over time. In the early years, it gave her freedom. In middle age, It gave her command, but in the final winters of her life, it gave her silence. The children she never bore did not come to hold her hand. The husband she never named did not come to say goodbye. She was surrounded only by women she had appointed, and men who had sworn fealty not to her heart, but to her title. And in that silence, something more painful than death lingered. Not regret. She had long since buried that, but awareness. She had built a throne so perfectly tailored to her own life that no one could step onto it without changing everything she had made. And so the throne sat empty for 3 weeks after she died. Not because there was no one to claim it, but because no one had been named. James of Scotland had long been the unspoken choice. Protestant, male, descended from Tudor blood through Margaret. But Elizabeth had never spoken his name aloud in the final hours. Some say she nodded when his name was mentioned. Others say she whispered it. But no decree was signed. No statement was made. She died without handing the scepter to another. She had ruled entirely. Absolutely. And until the very end, she had ruled alone. Those who stood around her coffin in those 3 weeks knew what it meant. A queen with no heir is a story half written. A reign with no successor is a garden uprooted in full bloom. And yet Elizabeth had seemed content with that, not at peace. Perhaps, but resolved. She had always known that her rule would end in silence, and she had accepted it long before her breath began to fail. Historians would later call her childlessness a tragedy. Some would call it a triumph. But within the quiet corridors of Whitehall, where her body rested beneath veils of black and the crown sat idle on its cushion, it was felt as something stranger, something sacred and unsettling. The Virgin Queen had passed without issue. And the line that had begun with Henry, that had roared with Edward and wept with Mary, had ended not in flames, but in stillness. And yet, it is in that stillness that her legacy took root. Because though she had no child to wear her name, no son to ride in her wake, she had shaped an age so profoundly that it would forever carry her mark. The Elizabethan era, her era, would come to mean more than just her lifetime. It would mean Shakespeare and sea voyages, rebellions suppressed and religions balanced, Spanish ships burned and English pride reborn. It would mean power wielded by a woman in a world that told women to kneel. It would mean a crown held by a hand that never released it. Not for love. Not for politics. Not even for family. And in that, she was immortal. Not through blood, but through story. Not through children, but through memory. And so the throne she left behind, though vacant, was not empty. It held the echo of her footsteps, the ghost of her voice, the weight of her choices. James would sit upon it, but it would never be entirely his. Just as Mary's tomb would always lie beneath Elizabeth's, so too would her presence linger beneath every crown that came after. In solitude, she had chosen her legacy. In silence, she had made her will. And in that silence, the throne waited, neither cold nor warm, neither welcoming nor defiant, simply waiting, as if to say, this belonged to her. Remember that. Close your eyes, and imagine her not as the marble effigy carved to lie forever beneath Westminster's vaulted arches, not as the glorious painting flanked by lions and embroidered silks, not even as the pale figure in white lead paint, standing beneath her father's shadow, but as she was in the silence. Imagine the face not shown to ambassadors or crowds, not drawn by court painters or cloaked in myth, but the face that remained when the candles were extinguished and the mirrors were covered for the night. The face behind the veil, the face behind the crown, the face that belonged to no one but herself. It is this face that lingers now, not in legend, but in memory's Keter corners. for all the world's books and portraits of portraits, for all the historians who have debated her every decision, for all the kings who followed, and the wars that rewrote her maps. There is something about Elizabeth that refuses to fade into clarity. She remains half known, half imagined. She spoke often, wrote much, commanded constantly, and yet the truest parts of her stayed, folded within the robes of silence she wore so expertly. She was the queen of spectacle, of theater, of transformation. But when she died, and the theater closed, the question that remained was not how she ruled, it was who she had been. When no one was looking, she had always belonged to the stage. Even as a child, Elizabeth had been schooled in performance, not merely in words, but in posture, in presentation, in survival, through control. Her father had destroyed wives as easily as he dismissed ministers. Her mother had died beneath an axe. Her siblings had vanished into fever, into politics, into flame. She had walked through that house of memory, with her head held high and her mouth carefully sealed. She learned how to speak so that her voice trembled only when she wanted it to. She learned how to hold a gaze until the men across the chamber looked away. She learned to dress not for vanity, but for power. Every pearl, every ruff, every inch of painted skin became a weapon, a warning, a wall. But walls grow heavy, and even queens must sleep. And so now, centuries later, as the candles of her world have long since burned to stubs and the perfume of her court faded into dust, we look for her, not in the proclamations, not in the plays, not in the painted myths, but in the quiet places, in the chamber where she stood alone for hours, in the lines on the mask that was made when breath had left her body, in the tremble of her hand when she heard Catherine Howard had died, in the whisper to the Archbishop that she would not lie down, in the moments where no one called her Majesty, and she was only Elizabeth. She had spent 45 years holding an empire together, not just with law and sword, but with story. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the mother of the people, the woman married only to England itself. These were not just titles, they were her armor. She wore them so long that even her bones remembered the weight of them. But inside, there must have still been the girl who had once crouched in fear when the guards came for her in the reign of Mary. The woman who had watched her cousin's execution from afar and told herself again and again that she had not truly consented. There must have been moments where she felt the coldness of her own power. Moments where she longed for something simpler than supremacy. And yet, she never set it down. Not once. She never abdicated. Never married. Never surrendered. She did not bend. Not to Pope or Parliament. Not to Spain or France. Not even to time. She ruled until the last hour. And when the breath finally left her, it was not in fury or resistance. It was in quiet exhaustion, as though the engine that had driven her had finally accepted that it could run no further. And so we remember her not because she was flawless, but because she was not. Not because she was kind, but because she was precise. Not because she gave the world everything it wanted, but because she gave it something it had never seen before. A woman who refused to be replaced. A monarch who chose silence when she could have screamed. A ruler who, when the throne was most threatened, said simply, "I have the heart and stomach of a king," and made the world believe it. Her tomb says little. Here lies Elizabeth, Queen of England and Ireland, daughter of Henry VIII, who reigned 45 years, a virgin and glorious queen. The words are carved in Latin, crisp and cold. as if the facts could hold her legacy together. But the stone cannot tell you how she grieved Blanche Parry, or how she recoiled at the death of Mary Stuart, or how she stood all night rather than let her body fall into rest. The stone cannot tell you how the lead beneath her makeup slowly poisoned her, or how the women who dressed her each morning saw the toll that history was taking on her skin. But we remember. We remember not the pageantry of her death, but the quiet horror of the truth it revealed, that a woman can rule a world and still die alone, that a crown can rest on a head that aches in the dark, that the face behind the veil is softer than history dares admit, and in remembering, we do not diminish her. We do not steal her glory. We give her something she was denied in life, the right to be human. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the candles burn low, I think of her not as a queen in gold, not as a legend in lace, but as a woman wrapped in silence, seated at the edge of her bed, staring out across a winter garden where all the flowers have withered, whispering names only she remembers. Think of her as someone who tried to do everything right and still broke, as someone who won the world but paid dearly for the keeping of it. And let that be enough. Let that be her rest. Let that be her crown.